Nature under Cardrine seem to be always instincts periphery.
I told you I was good at keeping people safe. It's the only life I ever knew.
Black SUV took the corner on two wheels, and nobody in the back seat understood, yet, that the woman behind the wheel had once been trained to do exactly this with a man bleeding out beside her. Adrian Calloway would remember the next 4 seconds for the rest of his life, in pieces that never quite fit back together in order. The sound the window made when it didn't shatter the way windows are supposed to, the way his new driver's hands moved before her eyes did, a strange calm in her voice when she said, without looking at him, "Stay low, I've got this." 3 months earlier, he had hired her because she was the only applicant willing to start that same afternoon, because she needed the job more than she needed to negotiate, and because her resume, thin, almost apologetic in its brevity, had listed 11 years of unspecified federal service that his head of security had glanced at for 4 seconds before tossing it onto the reject pile. Adrian had pulled it back out of the pile himself. He never told anyone why. He would have struggled to explain it even to himself. Something about the steadiness in her eyes during the interview, the way she'd answered every question without performing an answer, the way she'd looked at the salary offer and done quiet arithmetic in her head before saying yes in a voice that cost her something to keep level. He had built 3 companies and sat across from senators and watched men twice his age try to read him across a table, and he had learned, somewhere in all of that, to recognize the particular stillness of a person who had survived something the rest of the room hadn't. He didn't know what Mara Doyle had survived. Not yet. He only knew that something in her didn't match the rest of her application, and that the mismatch had felt, for reasons he couldn't name, like the safest thing in the building. 6 weeks later, on a Tuesday that started like every other Tuesday, that mismatch would put itself between him and a bullet, and the entire architecture of what he thought he knew about the quiet woman who drove him to work would come down in under a minute. But that morning, the only thing Mara Doyle was thinking about was a single shoe. It was the right one this time, not the left, hiding with the particular malice of objects that belonged to 7-year-olds, somewhere in the wreckage of a 1-bedroom apartment that always looked by 7 a.m. like it had survived a small and localized disaster. Junie stood in the kitchen doorway in one sock and one sneaker, hopping slightly for balance, narrating the search in the tone of someone filing an official report. "It's not under the couch. I already looked under the couch. It's never under the couch when I actually look." "Check your backpack," Mara said, not looking up from the stove, where she was doing the daily arithmetic of turning 2 eggs and the last of the bread into something that resembled a balanced breakfast for a growing girl on a grocery budget that had not grown along with her. "You put it there last week when you were mad at it." "I wasn't mad at it. We had a disagreement." "About what?" Pinched. Mara almost smiled. She had learned, in the 18 months since the divorce had quietly become a single income and a smaller apartment 2 neighborhoods further from the school Junie loved, that, almost smiling, was a survivable amount of joy to allow herself before 7 in the morning, the kind that didn't require explaining where the rest of it had gone. She plated the eggs. She checked the time. She did the silent math she did every single morning. Rent, the gap between what she made and what the apartment cost. The growing list of things Junie needed that always seemed to outpace, by exactly the margin that kept her awake at night, the things Mara could give her. She had been a federal contractor for 11 years. She did not discuss the specifics, not because she had been told not to, though she had, but because the specifics did not translate into anything a civilian conversation had room for. She had left because of an injury that had healed in the body, and not entirely in the part of her. Still woke up some nights, with her hand already reaching for a sidearm that wasn't there. She had spent the 2 years since trying to build a life shaped like an ordinary one. Community, college accounting classes, taken 2 at a time, around Junie's school schedule, string of jobs that paid rent, but never quite enough, apartment, with a window unit that fought the summer heat and lost. Driving job had come from a posting she almost hadn't applied to. Personal driver, private client, flexible but demanding hours, discretion required. The pay was almost exactly twice what she was making. She had filled out the application at the kitchen table with Junie doing homework across from her, had listed her military service in the vaguest terms her training allowed, had submitted it expecting nothing, the way she had learned to expect nothing from most things since the discharge papers. The callback had come the same evening. The interview had taken 11 minutes. The job offer had come before she'd reached her car in the parking garage. She hadn't asked why. She had needed the job more than she'd needed the answer. Junie found the shoe in the backpack, exactly where Mara had said it would be, and accepted this with the gracious indifference of a child who believed her mother capable of locating anything through some unspecified maternal magic. They left the apartment at 7:40, the same time they left every morning, down 3 flights of stairs that smelled faintly of someone else's breakfast, into a Tuesday that, from where Mara was standing, looked exactly like every other day she had built carefully out of routine and discipline, since the life she used to have had ended. 40 minutes north and 1 income bracket away, Adrian Calloway's Tuesday was beginning the white. Most of his Tuesdays began with a phone already ringing before his feet hit the floor. He answered without checking who it was, the habit of a man who had stopped being surprised by which fires needed putting out before 8 in the morning. It was Desmond Cray, his general counsel, and the first sentence out of Desmond's mouth told Adrian everything he needed to know about the rest of his day. "We have a problem with the Hadley filing." Adrian sat on the edge of the bed and rubbed his eyes, and did not ask which problem, because there had been 3 different problems with the Hadley filing over the past 6 weeks, and asking would only cost him time he didn't have. "Tell me how bad. Bad enough that I think you should hear it from me before you hear it from anyone else today." That sentence, more than any specific detail Desmond went on to explain, was the one that stayed with Adrian as he showered and dressed and packed the days, reading into a leather bag that had cost more than most people's monthly rent, and that he had, somewhere in the last year, stopped noticing the cost of entirely. Calloway Dynamics had grown past the point where Adrian could feel every decision in his own hands the way he once had, back when the company had been 4 people and a server closet, and an idea about predictive infrastructure software that everyone else had dismissed as too early for the market. It was not too early for the market anymore. It was, depending on which quarterly filing you trusted, the single largest private holder of municipal infrastructure data contracts on the eastern half of the country, and there were people, Adrian had learned this the hard way, more than once, who found that kind of leverage worth a great deal of trouble to acquire by means other than a fair offer. The Hadley filing was the latest front in a 6-month-long acquisition fight with a competitor named Sorrel Group, and Sorrel Group, Adrian had come to understand through several increasingly unpleasant conversations, did not appear to believe that losing was an acceptable outcome. He did not, that Tuesday morning, think of any of this as a threat to his physical safety. He thought of it as paperwork with teeth, the kind of corporate combat that happened in conference rooms and filings and very expensive lawyers' invoices. He had no reason yet to think otherwise. He came downstairs at 8:05 and found his driver already waiting at the curb, leaning against the SUV with the stillness she always carried, watching the street with an attention that he had noticed in their 6 weeks together and had never quite been able to place. "Morning, Mr. Calloway," Mara said, opening the rear door. "Morning." He paused before getting in, the way he sometimes did, studying her for a second too long without meaning to. "You're early again. I like to know the street before I drive it." She said it simply, like it was an obvious fact rather than a habit most drivers didn't bother with, and Adrian filed it away the way he filed away most small inconsistencies about Mara Doyle, a folder in his mind, growing slowly thicker with details that didn't quite add up to anything yet. The drive downtown took 31 minutes most days. Mara had learned the timing of every light on the route in her first week, had learned which intersections backed up at which hour, had learned, without being asked, the kind of granular competence that made a passenger forget they were being driven at all. Adrian spent the 31 minutes on his phone, the way he spent most 31-minute stretches of his life, fielding the slow bleed of Desmond's bad news, in increments designed not to overwhelm him all at once. He did not notice, that morning, the gray sedan that held 3 car lengths back through 2 lane changes it had no obvious reason to make. Mara did. She didn't say anything. There was nothing yet worth saying. Nothing concrete enough to bring to a man whose day was already collapsing under its own administrative weight. Nothing but a pattern her body had recognized before her conscious mind had finished cataloging it. The particular, non-aggressive aggression of a vehicle that was following without wanting to be noticed. Following. She adjusted her mirror by half an inch. She let her speed drift 2 miles under the limit, to see what the sedan did. It slowed to match her. She filed it, the way she had been trained to file things 11 years ago, and had never quite learned how to do. Not as fear, but as data. She said nothing to Adrian. She dropped him at the building at 8:36, watched him disappear through the revolving doors with his bag over one shoulder and his attention already 3 problems ahead of where his feet were. And then she sat in the parking structure for 4 minutes longer than she needed to, watching the entrance, before she let herself drive away. It was nothing yet. It might be nothing at all. But Mara Doyle had spent 11 years learning that the difference between nothing and everything was usually smaller than people wanted to believe, and that the cost of ignoring it was always paid by someone who hadn't seen it coming. She picked Junie up from school at 3:15, the same as every day, and for 2 more weeks, the gray sedan did not reappear, and the granular, unglamorous machinery of Mara's actual life, the rent due on the 1st, the parent-teacher conference Junie's teacher kept trying to schedule around Mara, shifting hours, the slow, careful work of building a life that looked, from the outside, like it had nothing extraordinary buried inside it, continued exactly as it had before. Inside the Calloway Dynamics building, a different kind of quiet machinery had been running for considerably longer than 2 weeks, and it had nothing to do with the Hadley filing at all. Dean Foss had run security for Adrian Calloway for 6 years, had built the protocol from nothing into something he was, by every reasonable professional measure, entitled to be proud of, and had not been consulted, not once, on the hiring of the new driver. He had found out about it the way he found out about most decisions Adrian made unilaterally, after the fact, through a memo, with no opportunity to weigh in on a hire that put a complete, unknown, directly inside the most vulnerable part of his principal's day. He had pulled Mara's file the first week and found almost nothing in it. 11 years of service. Redacted by classification level he didn't have clearance to challenge. No civilian work history that explained the gap. No references beyond a single contact number that rang to a voicemail box that never picked up. To Dean, that wasn't a mystery. It was a red flag wearing the costume of a mystery, and he had said so, twice. In meetings Adrian had attended with the patient, distracted courtesy of a man listening to a complaint he had already decided not to act on. She drives well, Adrian had said, the second time, closing the conversation the way he closed most conversations he considered finished. She's punctual. She's careful. I don't need her resume to read like yours, Dean. Dean had not argued further, not out loud, but he had kept a private log of every small thing about Mara Doyle that didn't sit right with him. The way she scanned a room on entry, before she scanned the person she was meeting. The way her eyes tracked exits in restaurants, the way his own training had taught him to, but that no ordinary driver would ever bother to learn, the way she had once, during a routine security briefing she hadn't been required to attend, but had shown up to anyway, asked a question about evacuation protocol, so specific and so correctly framed that 2 of his own junior staff had exchanged a glance. He did not know what she had done before she became a driver. He had decided, somewhere, in the accumulation of small, unexplainable details, that he didn't trust whatever it was, and that distrust had calcified, over 6 weeks, into something closer to resentment, the particular resentment of a professional who believes his territory has been quietly invaded by someone the boss likes better, for reasons that had nothing to do with competence, and everything to do with whatever ineffable thing had made Adrian Calloway pull her application back out of the reject pile in the first place. He didn't know about the gray sedan. Mara hadn't reported it, because there had been nothing yet to report, and because some old, deep-rooted part of her training had never fully unlearned the instinct to handle a developing situation quietly until it either resolved itself or became something worth raising an alarm over. That instinct, more than anything else, would later become the single detail that the post-incident review would spend the most time on, the 11 days during which Mara Doyle had clocked a developing threat to her employer's safety, and said almost nothing about it to anyone, not out of negligence, because she had spent 11 years being trained to assess before she escalated, and the habit had outlived the uniform that taught it to her. The gray sedan reappeared on a Thursday, 3 blocks from a downtown office, idling at a curb it had no business idling at, and this time it wasn't alone. A second vehicle, dark blue, sat half a block further down a side street that fed directly into, policed, the route Mara had used for 6 weeks running. She changed the route without explanation, taking Adrian 11 minutes longer to the office, through a path that looked, to him, like nothing more than ordinary traffic avoidance. "Construction on 5th, she said, when he glanced up from his phone, mildly curious about the detour. Wasn't worth the wait. It was the first lie she had told him since taking the job, and it sat uneasily in her chest the entire rest of the drive. Not because she regretted it, but because some part of her, the part that had spent 11 years learning exactly how much truth a person needed in order to stay safe without panicking, understood that she was now actively managing information for a man who had no idea he needed managing. She began, that week, doing things Dean Foss would have recognized immediately, and Adrian never noticed at all. She varied her arrival times by intervals just large enough to disrupt a pattern. She memorized 3 alternate routes to every regular destination on Adrian's calendar. She started parking the SUV nose out at every stop, a habit so old and so automatic that she didn't consciously register doing it anymore. The kind of muscle memory that survives long after the context that built it has been packed away in a box, somewhere with a folded flag on top of it. And on the following Monday, in the parking structure beneath the Calloway Dynamics building, she found, taped to the underside of the SUV's Fire's rear bumper, where only someone who made a habit of checking would ever find it, a small magnetic tracking device the size of a matchbox. She stood there in the gray fluorescent light for almost a full minute, simply looking at it, feeling something in her chest settle into a register she hadn't visited in 2 years. A Ranjan's register that was not quite fear and not quite anger, but something colder and more useful than either. This was no longer nothing. She did not call Dean Foss. She called a number she still had memorized, despite every effort the last 2 years had made to let it fade. A former unit contact, who now did private threat consulting for clients who needed answers fast and quiet, and asked him, in a voice she kept carefully flat, to run a trace on a race, whose serial number she read off through the phone, while standing alone in a parking garage on her lunch break. 3 states, and a lifetime away from the last time she had needed to make a call exactly like this one. The answer came back 2 days later. The device had been purchased through a shell account traceable, with effort, to a security contractor who did, among other things, occasional off-the-books surveillance work for corporate clients, who preferred not to leave fingerprints. Contractor's most recent known engagement, according to the kind of database access that Mara Contact still had, and Mara herself officially did not, was with a firm called Sorrell Group. She sat with that information for exactly 1 night before deciding what to do with it, turning over the way she had once turned over intelligence reports in rooms that no longer existed and improve her current life, weighing the cost of raising an alarm that might not be believed against the cost of staying quiet about a threat that was clearly, demonstrably real. By morning, she had made her decision. It was not the one Dean Foss would have made in her position, and it was not, strictly speaking, the one her old training manuals would have recommended either. She decided to keep doing exactly what she had been doing, driving carefully, varying the routes, watching the mirrors, saying nothing, because the moment she raised the alarm formally, through channels, with a man who had already decided not to trust her, the threat would know it had been detected, and a detected threat, in her experience, simply became a more careful one. Better, for now, to let it believe it was still invisible. Better to be the only person who knew exactly how close the danger actually was. It was a decision built entirely out of the part of her that the last 2 years of ordinary, civilian life had never managed to retire, and it would, 11 days later, the only thing standing between Adrian Calloway and a bullet that Sorrell Group's hired contractor had been instructed, in increasingly explicit terms, to make sure landed. The 11 days that followed were, on the surface, entirely unremarkable. Mara drove Adrian to work and back. She picked Junie up at 3:15 and helped her with a school project about the water cycle. That required, for reasons Junie never fully explained, a diorama made primarily out of cotton balls and blue construction paper. She did the math on rent again, the same math she did every week, and found it came out the same uncomfortable amount short, and she put aside, for the 4th week running, the thought of mentioning to Adrian that the job's pay, generous as it was compared to what she'd had before, still wasn't generous enough to close the gap entirely. She had decided early on never to make her own situation his problem. It was a small, private dignity she had not been willing to give up, along with everything else the last 2 years had already taken. Adrian, for his part, noticed things about Mara during those 11 days that he filed away, without understanding why he was filing them. The way she had started parking differently. The way she'd taken to arriving 7 minutes earlier than her contract required, every single day, without ever mentioning it. The way, once, when a delivery truck had backed too quickly out of a loading dock ahead of them, she had braked and angled the SUV in a single fluid motion that had felt, for half a second, less like defensive driving and more like something rehearsed. He asked her about it, once, almost casually, on the drive home on a Wednesday. You ever do this kind of work before? Driving, I mean. Some. She kept her eyes on the road. Different version of it. What's the difference? She was quiet long enough that he almost asked again. And then she said, in a voice that gave away nothing and somehow told him everything at once. The stakes used to be higher. He laughed, the small surprised laugh of a man who didn't quite know whether he'd just heard a joke or a confession, and let the subject drop, because the car had reached his building, and because some instinct, the same instinct that had pulled her file out of the reject pile in the first place, told him not to push on a door she had only opened by an inch. He would think about that exchange a great deal. Later, in the hospital, replaying the small, flat honesty of it against everything he learned afterward, understanding only then how much restraint it must have cost her to say that little and no more. The day it happened started exactly the way the day that opened this story started, with a single shoe, hiding from a 7-year-old with the particular malice of small objects belonging to children, and ended with Adrian Calloway flat on the floor of his own SUV, his ears ringing from a sound he would later learn was a round passing through the rear windshield, at a speed and an angle that should, by every reasonable calculation, have found him, instead of the headrest, 6 inches from his skull. Mara had clocked the dark blue sedan 2 blocks before the ambush began. She had clocked, with the same cold clarity she had used in the parking garage 11 days earlier, precise moment the vehicle's behavior shifted from following to closing, and in this half-second between recognizing the threat and the threat announcing itself with the crack of a single suppressed shot through the rear window, 11 years of training that 2 years of ordinary civilian life had never managed to erase, came back online, inside her, all at once. The way a language you haven't spoken in years comes back the instant you standing in a room where it's the only thing being spoken. Stay low, I've got this. She didn't shout it. She said it the way she said everything, flat and certain, and something in the certainty of it was enough to make Adrian, frozen with the particular paralysis of a man who has never in his life been shot at, fold himself down into the space between the seats, without questioning whether he should. What happened in the next 90 seconds would be reconstructed afterward from traffic, cameras, from the dashcam footage of 3 different vehicles that happened to be on the same stretch of road, and from Mara's own report, given in a voice so flat and procedural that the first detective taking it down would later tell his partner it was like taking a statement from someone reading a manual. She took the corner on 2 wheels, not because it looked dramatic, but because it was, by a margin of perhaps 4 miles an hour, the fastest way to put a parked delivery truck between the SUV and the second shooter's line of sight. She drove the next 6 blocks in a pattern that the responding officers, watching the footage later, would describe using words like evasive and tactical, without quite being able to explain where a private driver had learned to drive that way. She did not, at any point, lose control of the vehicle. She lost, for perhaps 4 seconds total, the careful civilian posture she had spent 2 years building, and underneath it was something that had clearly never gone anywhere at all. The pursuing sedan clipped a parked car trying to match her third turn, and spun out hard enough to disable itself against a fire hydrant. Mara did not stop to confirm this. She drove 3 more blocks, pulled into the loading entrance of a hotel she had memorized in her first week on the job, specifically because its security desk was staffed 24 hours, and its back corridor had no street-facing windows, and got Adrian, still curled below the seats, inside the building and behind a locked door, before she let herself, for the first time since the window had cracked, feel her hands begin to shake. "You're okay," she said, to him, and then, quieter, almost to herself, "You're okay." The police arrived 9 minutes later. Dean Foss arrived 11 minutes after that. His face the particular gray of a man whose entire professional identity had just been outmaneuvered by someone he had spent 6 weeks actively distrusting And the first thing he said to Mara, before he said anything about the shooter, before he asked if Adrian was hurt, was, "Who taught you to drive like that?" It was not, strictly speaking, question anyone in that hallway expected to be the most important one of the day. It would turn out to be exactly that. The investigation that followed moved with the particular speed that only money and political pressure can generate. Within 6 hours, the disabled sedan's registration had been traced through 2 shell companies to a security contractor with a documented history of off-book corporate work. Within 12 hours, federal investigators, invited in not by Calloway Dynamics, but by a bureau field office that had been quietly building its own file on Sorrell Group for entirely unrelated reasons, and recognized, the moment the report crossed a particular desk, exactly whose name belonged at the center of it, had a working theory that the attempted hit had been ordered as the final escalation in a hostile acquisition fight that had already cost both companies tens of millions of dollars in legal fees, and was, according to internal communications later recovered under subpoena, costing Sorrell Group's CEO considerably more in patience. None of that, in the first hours after the ambush, was what dominated the room. What dominated the room, in the hospital corridor where Adrian had been taken for observation despite being, by some margin he would spend the rest of his life being grateful for, almost entirely unharmed, was the question of who, exactly, his driver actually was. It was Desmond Cray, of all people, who found the answer. Because Desmond Cray had spent 11 years as a defense attorney before moving into corporate counsel, and still had the kind of contacts that could move classification requests through channels other people didn't know existed. He came to the hospital at 11 that night, with a thin folder under his arm, and the particular, careful expression of a man who has just read something he was not entirely supposed to be able to read. He did not show the folder to anyone except Adrian, and he did not show all of it, even to him. The part he did share, sitting in a hospital room with the lights low and Adrian propped up against pillows, still processing the fact that he was alive, changed the shape of everything that came after. Doyle had not been a federal contractor in the vague administrative sense her application had implied. She had been, for 11 years, one of a small number of women who had completed Naval Special II warfare combat training during a period when the program had only just begun formally. Admitting them, had served 3 deployments attached to operations whose details remained classified at a level Desmond Women's contact had been unwilling to specify beyond a single line. Exceptional valor, single combat extraction, 1 wounded operator recovered under direct fire, and had separated from service 2 years earlier, following an injury sustained during the final deployment that the file referred to, in language stripped of all drama, as line of duty, non-combat-related aggravation of prior combat injury. There was a citation in the file. Desmond did not read it aloud. He simply closed the folder and looked at Adrian for a long moment and said, in the careful tone of a man choosing his words with unusual precision, "She has spent the last 2 years driving carpool and doing your grocery runs to your downtown office, Adrian, and not one person in this building thought to ask her why a woman with that record was applying for a job that pays less than she's worth in a single hour of whatever she used to do." Adrian didn't say anything for a long time. He was thinking. He would say later, not about the file, not about the citation, but about a single sentence she had said to him on a Wednesday afternoon 2 weeks earlier, in a tone so flat he had almost missed the weight underneath it. The stakes used to be higher. He found her the next morning in the hospital cafeteria, sitting alone at a corner table with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched, still wearing the same clothes from the day before, because she had refused, twice, to leave the building until the doctors confirmed he was fully clear. She looked up when he sat down across from her, and something in her face, guarded, tired, braced for a conversation she had clearly been expecting and dreading in equal measure, told him she already knew what he'd found out. "You read the file," she said. "It wasn't a question. Some of it. Desmond wouldn't show me all of it. He shouldn't have shown you any of it." There was no anger in her voice, only the flat exhaustion of someone who had spent 2 years carefully building a wall and had just watched it come down from the other side, in a manner entirely outside her control. "That part of my life isn't supposed to be a thing people read about over coffee. Why didn't you tell me?" She turned the coffee cup a quarter turn on the table, the kind of small physical task people give themselves when they need a few extra seconds before answering a question honestly. Because the version of me that did those things isn't the version of me I get to be anymore. I have a kid who needs a mother who comes home every night with all her fingers and no nightmares, loud enough to wake her up. I took a job that let me be ordinary, Mr. Calloway. I needed ordinary. I needed it more than I needed anyone in this building to know what I used to be capable of. You saved my life yesterday, using exactly what you used to be capable of. I know. For the first time since he'd sat down, something in her composure shifted, not into tears, but into something quieter and more complicated, an exhaustion that had been building. He understood suddenly, for far longer than the last 18 hours. And now everybody's going to want to talk about it. And I'm going to have to find a way to be both things again, the ordinary one and the other one. And I genuinely don't know yet if I have it in me to do that twice. Adrian sat with that for a long moment, turning over a dozen things he might say, and discarding most of them as inadequate, until he landed, finally, on the only one that felt true. You don't have to be ordinary for my sake. I hired you because something about you didn't add up. And I liked that you didn't add up. Just didn't expect the answer to be this big. She almost smiled then, the same almost smile she allowed herself most mornings over a stove and 2 eggs. For the first time in 2 years, it reached all the way to her eyes. Weeks that followed were, in their own way, louder than the ambush itself. Sorrell Group's CEO was indicted within a month on charges that ran considerably beyond the attempted hit. Once federal investigators, working backward from the contractor's financial trail, uncovered a pattern of corporate sabotage stretching back years across multiple targets, of which Calloway Dynamics had simply been the most recent and the most violently mishandled. Dean Foss, to his credit, was the one who insisted, in the post-incident review, the record reflect plainly that the company's security division had failed to identify a credible threat that its own driver had quietly been managing alone for 11 days, and that whatever remained of his professional pride mattered less to him than making sure Mara Doyle's competence went on record exactly as it deserved to. He found her afterward, in the parking structure, where it had all technically begun, and said the thing he had not been able to say in the hospital hallway. I should have trusted you sooner. Let what I didn't understand about you turn into something I decided not to like. And that's on me, not you. He held out a hand. For what it's worth, there's no one I'd rather have behind the wheel. She shook it. For what it's worth, I'd have done the same thing in your position. You didn't have my file. You just had a hunch and a closed door. Doesn't make it right. No, she agreed. But it makes it human. Calloway Dynamics did not, in the end, simply give Mara a raise and a quiet thank you, and move on. Though the raise came, substantial. Enough to finally close the gap she had been doing silent arithmetic over for 2 years. Adrian created, with her input, and over her initial and genuine objection, a new position inside the company's security division. Not driver, not bodyguard, something closer to a threat assessment lead. A role built specifically around the exact instincts that had kept her quietly tracking a danger no one else had clocked for 11 days before it became impossible to ignore. She took the job on the condition that it never required her to be away from Junie overnight, condition Adrian agreed to without negotiation, the same way he had once pulled her application back out of a reject pile without quite knowing why. Junie, for her part, processed the entire event with the particular directness of a 7-year-old who had been told only the parts of the truth her mother judged she was old enough to carry. That Mom's old job sometimes meant keeping people safe, that the bad men in the car had been caught, that everyone was okay. She absorbed this with the same gracious efficiency she applied to most surprising facts about her mother's life, filing it somewhere between the discovery that Mom could parallel park better than anyone else's parent, and the discovery, slightly more recently, that Mom apparently used to jump out of helicopters, a detail Junie had extracted through a combination of guesswork and persistent questioning that Mara had eventually, tiredly, confirmed. Did you know Mr. Calloway before you saved him? Junie asked one evening, doing homework at the kitchen table, while Mara made dinner in an apartment that, for the first time in 2 years, did not require quite so much silent arithmetic to keep afloat. Not really. I just drove him to work. But now you know him. I suppose I do. Does he come over? Mara paused with a spoon halfway to a pot, caught slightly off guard by the directness of the question, the way only a child can ask the thing an adult has been carefully not asking herself. He's come by once or twice, to check on things. Is he nice? She thought about the hospital cafeteria, about the way he had sat down across from her without flinching from the file Desmond had shown him, about the question he had asked that had nothing to do with her record and everything to do with her. You don't have to be ordinary for my sake. And found, somewhat to her own surprise, that the answer came easily. Yeah, she said. He's nice. Adrian did, in fact, come by more than once or twice in the months that followed. First, under the entirely legitimate cover of checking on his new threat assessment lead, onboarding. Then, under increasingly thin covers that both of them privately recognized as covers, and neither of them bothered to point out. He learned the names of Junie's stuffed animals. He learned, the hard way, Junie's water cycle diorama had taken longer than expected and required, for reasons that remained obscure to him, an emergency run for more cotton balls at 9 at night, a task he undertook without complaint and reported back from with the seriousness of a man closing a much larger deal. He learned, slowly, the texture of an ordinary life he had stopped having access to somewhere around his second $100 million, and found, to his own quiet astonishment, he had missed it more than he'd realized. On a Friday evening 4 months after the ambush, he showed up at the apartment with a bag of takeout and the particular nervousness of a man who has negotiated 9-figure acquisitions without breaking a sweat and could not, for the life of him, figure out how to ask a woman to dinner that wasn't disguised as checking on the kid. Mara opened the door, already half laughing at him, before he'd said a word. You could just ask, she said. Ask what? Whatever it is you've been not asking for the last month. He stood there for a second, holding the bag of takeout, looking at her in the doorway of an apartment that held nothing extraordinary in it except the 2 people who lived there, and found, finally, the plain version of the question he'd been circling for weeks. Dinner. Just the 3 of us. Not a check-in, not a security review, just dinner. She stepped back from the door to let him in. The table has room, she said. Junie, who had been listening from the kitchen with the unembarrassed attentiveness of children who have not yet learned that eavesdropping is supposed to be subtle, appeared in the doorway, holding her stuffed rabbit, and looked between the 2 adults with the satisfied expression of someone whose long-running theory had just been confirmed. Finally, she said, and went to set an extra place at the table without being asked. They ate at the small kitchen table, the 3 of them, the window cracked and the ordinary noise of the building settling in around them. And at some point during the meal, watching Adrian patiently field Junie's increasingly the specific questions about whether billionaires were allowed to have favorite colors, Mara found herself thinking, not for the first time since that Tuesday on the road, about the strange arithmetic of her own life. How the version of her that had once kept a wounded man alive under fire, and the version of her that turned eggs into breakfast on a budget that never quite stretched far enough had turned out, in the end, not to be 2 different people, requiring 2 different disguises, but one person whose full capacity had simply been waiting, all along, for someone willing to look past a thin resume and ask the right question. She had spent 2 years believing she had to choose between being ordinary and being whatever she had been before. Sitting at that table, watching her daughter explain, at considerable length, the correct way to fold a paper airplane to a man who ran a company worth more than the entire neighborhood they lived in, she understood, finally, that she had never actually needed to choose at all. Later that night, after Junie had been put to bed, and Adrian had lingered at the door the way people do when they aren't quite ready for an evening to end, Mara stood in the doorway and said the thing she had been turning over since the cafeteria. For what it's worth, I'm glad you pulled my file back out of that pile. For what it's worth, Adrian said. So am I. The city went on outside the window, the way it always had, indifferent and enormous, full of people who would never know how close a single Tuesday afternoon had come to ending very sick. Differently. For a billionaire, who had once needed a driver. For a daughter, who would never know how much her mother had carried quietly to keep her safe. And for a woman, who had spent 2 years convinced that the only way to protect the life she'd craved was to bury the parts of herself capable of doing it, until the day the road demanded otherwise, and she discovered, in the space of 90 seconds, that the thing she had been hiding had never stopped being the thing that made her exactly who she was. Dean Foss kept the dashcam footage from that afternoon longer than department policy strictly required. Not out of sentiment, he told himself, but because new hires in the security division had a way of doubting what a calm voice and a steady set of hands could actually accomplish under fire, and there was no better teaching tool than 91 seconds of unedited proof. Played it for every recruit who came through the program after that, always pausing it at the same frame. The moment the SUV cleared the delivery truck with 4 inches to spare, and Mara's hands had already begun adjusting for the next turn before the first one had finished. And he always said the same thing afterward, in the dry, instructive tone of a man who had learned a hard lesson and intended to spare the next person from learning it the same way. Nobody in this footage is panicking, he'd say. That's the whole lesson. Panic is a luxury. She didn't have time for it, and neither will you. The civil suit against Sorrell Group's leadership settled 8 months later for an amount large enough to make the business press forget, almost entirely, that the story had ever involved an actual attempted murder, rather than the kind of bloodless corporate scandal that usually filled those columns. Adrian testified once, briefly, in a closed deposition, and afterward told Desmond Cray that the strangest part of the entire ordeal had not been the gunfire, or the hospital, or the file Desmond had shown him at 11 o'clock that night, but the simple, durable fact that none of it had changed who Mara was at the kitchen table on an ordinary Tuesday, that the woman who had once kept a wounded operator alive, under fire, on the other side of the world, was, fundamentally, the same woman who burned the toast twice a week and still made Junie eat the crust. People keep asking me if I was scared of her, after I found out, Adrian said. I wasn't. I think I was relieved. I'd spent 6 years surrounded by men who looked dangerous, and turned out to be exactly as dangerous as they looked. She looked like nothing at all, and turned out to be the only person in the building who actually knew what to do. Mara never did go back to wearing that part of herself the way she once had. She didn't need to. The job Adrian built for her didn't ask her to be a soldier again. It asked her to notice things, to read a room and a route and a stranger's posture the way she always had, and to teach a small, growing team of analysts to do the same, without ever needing to fire a weapon to prove the instinct was real. She kept the hours she needed to keep for Junie, every single one of them, and Calloway Dynamics, to its credit, never once treated that boundary as a negotiation. On the 1-year anniversary of the ambush, nobody at the company marked the date out loud. Mara picked Junie up at 3:15, same as always, helped her with a fractions worksheet she found more confusing than her daughter did, and made dinner for 3, because by then, it was almost always dinner for 3, and the table had long since stopped feeling like it had room left over for anyone else. She thought about the gray sedan sometimes, on quiet drives, the way you think about a door you walked through once, and can't quite remember closing behind you. She did not regret walking through it. She had spent 2 years believing that the price of safety was silence, that the only way to keep the people she loved out of danger was to make sure no one ever asked what she used to be capable of. It had taken 91 seconds on an ordinary Tuesday to teach her otherwise, that the thing she had been so carefully hiding had never been a danger to the life she was building. It had been the reason that life was still standing at all.